statement, and we now move on to the backbench debate on Holocaust Memorial Day. Dame Margaret Hodge to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered Holocaust Memorial Day 2024. I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon, though he's not in his seat, the Honourable Member for East Renfrewshire and the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland for co-sponsoring this debate. I pay immense tribute to two organisations, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and the Holocaust Education Trust. They both devote much energy and time to organising the events that help us to commemorate the Holocaust. Without their excellent work, we would not keep alive the memory of those who lost their lives in the Nazi death camps, or indeed those who were killed in other genocides, from Rwanda to Cambodia to Bosnia and to Darfur. Without them, our efforts to learn the lessons of history would weaken and fade away. Hear, hear. Yeah. This is the last time, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I shall have the privilege of participating in this enormous debate. Yet it could not be a more difficult and depressing time to do so. I have just returned from a short visit to Israel. We went to support the people who lived on Kfar Aza, a kibbutz we visited in February last year. Many living on that kibbutz were people committed to peaceful coexistence with their neighbours in Gaza. But tragically, many were killed on the 7th of October. Many who survived are distraught because their loved ones were captured as hostages. And many, especially the women, were treated with the utmost abominable sadistic cruelty, sexually assaulted in utterly inhumane ways, and then murdered. Israel is experiencing a national trauma and a real fear of existential survival, with the memories of the Holocaust at the heart of their minds. And the same, Madam Deputy Speaker, is true in Gaza, with innocent civilians experiencing a similar national trauma, an identical fear of existential survival, a comparable terror of genocide as they live with bombardment, death, injury, displacement, and a lack of humanitarian aid. So we meet at a deeply depressing time to reflect on the Holocaust, with many thinking, when will the world ever really learn from our past? But the truth, Madam Deputy Speaker, is we must keep trying. This year's focus for Holocaust Memorial Day is the fragility of freedom. That theme allows us to reflect on how, by better understanding the past and better understanding how freedom can be easily eroded, we can act today to make the world a better place for those fleeing persecution today. I want to raise these matters in the context of my own family's experience. Like others, I lost close relatives in the Holocaust. My grandmother, whose last written words to her son, my uncle, were, "Don't forget me completely." My uncle, whose wife wrote in a letter pleading for his release, "He's only a number to you. He's everything to me." But I had other relatives who escaped days before the start of the war and were dispersed across the diaspora as they sought safety. They too were victims of the assault on Jews. They too suffered hugely. They too should be the focus of our concerns as we commit ourselves to it never happening again. My grandfather came to England on March the 29th, 1939. He was 66 and had just recovered from a prostate operation and an embolism in his leg. We have a powerful account of his experience and his emotions in the diary that he kept. He describes his last visit to his parents' graves in Vienna in tears because he would never visit those graves again. He recalls how his parents, my great-grandparents, visited the graves of their own parents, my great-great-grandparents, in Poland, in tears, because they were driven out of their homes by pogroms, a never-ending cycle of violence. He then describes his feelings a few days after arriving in England, writing, and I quote, Because of the lack of language skills, very lonely, depressed, cannot memorise, miserable pronunciation, living like a recluse. Even 6 months later, he says that those who stayed in Vienna, and I quote again, may have saved themselves from all the horrors and difficulties of emigrating. He talks about anti-Semitism in Britain and how it reached up into the government when the only Jew in the cabinet was sacked by Neville Chamberlain. On his arrival to Britain, my refugee Jewish grandfather was classified an enemy alien, though that was later changed to being a friendly but still an alien. Then on 8:30 a.m. on the 27th of June 1940, in the middle of the war that led to the death of 6 million Jews, when my grandfather was in his bath, there was a knock on the door. He was arrested, removed from his home and interned. He tried to ring his doctor who could certify to his illnesses, but then, as today, no doctor picked up the phone. He was taken to Guyton in Liverpool and was given a number, group number 28/2, number 1428. He was housed in overcrowded conditions with a rubber sheet, straw and blankets. In the early days, he was not allowed to write or receive letters. The sanitary conditions were dreadful, and the German Jews found themselves housed with German Nazis. His freedom was indeed fragile, and our treatment of Jewish refugees unconscionable. Fast forward to my own experience. I came to the UK stateless in 1949 from Egypt. After the creation of Israel, Egypt became an increasingly hostile environment for Jews. My father had a stone thrown through the window of his office, and with the memory of the Holocaust still raw in his mind, he decided to get the family out of Egypt. We were rejected by 3 English-speaking countries, and the UK finally, to my father's eternal gratitude, gave our family of 6 entry visas to this country. My father's freedom was indeed fragile. 5 years later, we were still stateless, and my father applied for British nationality. At that time, my mother was dying in hospital, my older sister and brother were away at school and university, so I was at home with my younger sister. She was 6 and I was 9. A Home Office inspector came to tea. I remember that occasion vividly. Instead of our usual boiled eggs and toast, we had to eat cucumber sandwiches and fruitcake, which I absolutely hated because I'd grown up on succulent fresh fruit in the Middle East. Worst of all, we were interrogated, 2 young girls on their own, for a full hour on who our friends were, what books we read, and what games we played. My freedom, it was indeed fragile, dealing with a hostile, not a friendly environment that remains forever locked in my memory. And what do all these stories tell us? My family knows, and indeed the families of millions of refugees know, that freedom is never a guarantee. We as a nation should understand that how we treat those who escape from persecution and genocide is central to our reputation as a country that boasts a humanitarian approach to genocide and the Holocaust.
Would the right honourable lady give way on that point? Can I commend the honourable lady for barking and bringing this forward, and for the very tone of how it's been put forward. As we all are here, most of us are anyway, a proud friend of Israel. When we consider that the nation of Israel was put through because so many people would not speak out, we see the results in the horrific atrocity that is remembered today. Does the right honourable lady not agree that we do not remember out of a sense of morbidity, but rather out of an absolute necessity to ensure that the lessons that have been taught through the slaughter of the Jewish people will be learned by people of all faiths and never be permitted to take place again?
I completely share that sentiment expressed by the honourable member. Going back to my training, we're not as good as we proclaim to be. My grandfather didn't feel welcome. I didn't feel wanted as a 9-year-old girl. And the asylum seekers who try to come here today face a similar hostile environment, told by leading government politicians that they pose, I quote, an existential threat to the West's way of life, that they are part of a, and I quote, hurricane of mass migration, that MPs feel, quote, besieged by asylum seekers, and that asylum seekers are, quote, invading Britain. We should reflect, Madam Deputy Speaker, on what we say and what we do today before we exercise any moral entitlement to condemn the atrocities of the past. The language we use today matters. The laws and practices of today designed to exclude many of those seeking freedom from persecution, which make a mockery of our commitment to the victims of genocide, matters. The fees we charge for visas today matter. Our refusal today to allow those seeking asylum to work matters. The hostility my grandfather faced in 1938 and the trepidation I felt when subjected to questioning in 1954 echoes through the generation. All of this contributes to our credibility in the debate on the Holocaust and subsequent genocides. So before we applaud ourselves for keeping alive the memory of the Holocaust, we should think about how fragile freedom was then for those who sought to escape death and how fragile it remains today. We must take responsibility and stand up to genocide wherever it rears its ugly head, and we must protect those who seek refuge in Britain. Because if we stand by while genocides unfold, or fail to protect those who need it the most, the horrors, the like of which my grandfather and my father and even myself experienced, will have been for nothing. Freedom, Madam Deputy Speaker, is one of our basic values. So surely we owe it to our children, our children's children, to be able to stand up and really mean it when we say never again.
The question is, as on the order paper, Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Speaker, can I apologise to you and to the Right Honourable Lady for missing the first minute of her speech? I was trying to get a transcript of the hearing yesterday at the Select Committee on the Holocaust Memorial Bill, when four of the witnesses were Joanna Millen, Anita Lasker-Wolfish, Trudy Gold and Dr. Lydia Tischler, each of whom are Holocaust survivors. And some in the House will have been present at the service when the Holocaust candles were lit. 5 of them were lit. I was asked to stand in for someone who had a transport difficulty. I did the one for those who suffered at Darfur. We've been given a good introduction to this debate with the moving speech we've heard. I hope it will be possible to put on wider record the experience of the 4 people I've quoted who came as witnesses produced by Baroness Deach, Ruth Deach, who herself talked about how her family had been destroyed in the Nazi Holocaust. We've rightly been reminded that our hands are not clean. It would have been possible for the State of Israel to have been created in the 1930s, and possibly 6 million people would have survived. 3/4 of the Jews in Europe died. And I've said in the past how much I welcome the emphasis which the Holocaust Commission, followed up by words from the Holocaust Memorial Foundation, put on education. I said that I'd had a vague idea that perhaps 10 of my grandfather's cousins' extended family had died. We now know it's over 110, possibly over 120. That kind of education matters. I don't claim to have had the family experience that the Honourable Lady has had, but I think that more of us will know and understand more if we have a personal connection of some kind. And I've spoken in the past about my first cousin once removed, George Woodcock, who was one of the Westminster Medical School students who thought they were going to help people suffering from malnutrition in the Netherlands, and were diverted to Bergen-Belsen, when they helped save the lives of 2/3 of those who were still breathing at the time of liberation. I think that on another occasion we can have a further debate about the controversial proposals for the memorial in Victoria Tower Gardens. I don't want to disturb this debate with going into too much detail about that now. What I would say is that if people get the chance, they should go to the Imperial War Museum, to the Holocaust galleries, and if possible, read a copy of the book produced 3 years ago by James Bulgin, which describes how things grew. And if I may, I'd like to quote one paragraph about Adolf Hitler. Hitler's early years of adulthood were spent pursuing an unsuccessful career as an artist in Vienna. Service in the First World War changed his life, however, giving his aimless existence a new sense of purpose and direction. Radicalized by the shock of defeat, he became convinced that Jews had conspired to ensure Germany's downfall. These ideas were first introduced to him by soldiers he was convalescing with after being injured during the war. After the war, he was sent to spy on a Nazi meeting, but became enraptured by the message of the movement. By 1921, he had become the leader of the Nazi Party. In 1923, Hitler led an ill-fated attempt to overthrow the government, which became known as the Munich Putsch. He planned to take control of the Bavarian state government and then march on Berlin. The uprising was quickly suppressed and Hitler was arrested. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for treason, but was released after just 8 months. That is a decade before he took his National Socialist Party, Nazi Party, from doing pretty badly in the last elections in the 1920s to doing reasonably well in the proportional representation elections in 1933. The people who thought they had control of Germany thought they'd make him Chancellor as a way of controlling him. They were wrong. We have to understand that education associated with the Holocaust, and whatever name you choose to use it, because the Holocaust is a relatively recent name to be given to the horrors, the terrors, and the intended annihilation of a whole people, that people come up in the way Adolf Hitler did. People may have gone to a meeting, found a small group, turned into a more powerful one, recruited a private army, started marching around with the aim of taking control. And if that sounds familiar to recent events in other countries, so be it. We have to beware of private militias. We have to give the state a monopoly of violence, or potential of violence, being able to resist by force those who are behaving dangerously badly. And we have to make sure that message isn't just known in this country, but is known in other countries as well. When I first stood for election, there were about 40 countries around the world that had reasonably democratic political systems, where people who lost elections accepted the fact they'd lost. That number increased to about 80 or 90. The number of countries in the world rose from about 290 to about 210. But now I think going backwards, there may be more people having a better standard of life, but I don't think they've got a better standard of democracy. The flexibility of people willing to use elections as a way of accepting defeat, not a way of guaranteeing victory, matters. But we do have to have a way of controlling, and if necessary, confronting with force, those who would use force to subvert our country, or any country, and to try to have a genocidal attack on a whole group of people defined by their race, their religion, or for those who are Jewish, in effect, the overlap between the two. When there was the attack on October the 7th in Israel, and on Israelis, someone wrote to me saying, why do they keep picking on us? There are 16 million Jews around the world. The number would probably be 3 times higher if it hadn't been for the Holocaust. I think we have a responsibility to get the educational side of Holocaust going better. We ought to make sure that people don't just get the chance of coming to see an exhibition, but in virtually all parts of their life, whether it's geography, history, current affairs, international relations, they understand how people rose to take control of their countries, so they take part in something which is different and an alternative. I understand I won't always get my way. I won't get my way within my own party, I won't get my own way within my own parliament, I won't get it within the country, I may not always be re-elected. I think it's important that we learn the lessons that democracy is about trying to achieve a good purpose, but being willing to be defeated and to try again without having to take the street with guns or go into exile. Even more, we have to make sure people don't find themselves dead because of other people's prejudices and very, very cruel behaviours.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I too thank the Backbench Business Committee for making time available for this debate, and to acknowledge and indeed express some gratitude for the way in which the application was dealt. You know, I felt when we went to the committee that we were pushing at an open door, and that their willingness to find time in the chamber for this debate was exceptionally welcome, because this is a year of all years where I think it is important that this debate should be brought right to the very heart of Parliament, and that's why it would of course be no less powerful in Westminster Hall, but I think it really matters that it's here. Can I also pay tribute to my co-sponsor in this, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Barking. I thought her speech in this was one of the finest I've heard in the 22 years in Parliament. It would have been powerful just for her to stand up and to share her family experience, but actually for her then to take the family experience and to draw the parallels and the lessons from the world today, I thought made it a wholly exceptional contribution. And I say to her that she will be missed. She will be remembered, but she will be missed in future Holocaust Memorial Day debates. I reflect, Madam Deputy Speaker, that next year it will be 80 years since the end of the Second World War. And as every year that passes, I think the act of memorial becomes more and more important. The House can do the maths for themselves. I was born in 1965. So I was born 20 years after the end of the Second World War. I was born into a world where many of the older people in my community had a lived experience of it. They had fought in different parts of the world. They made their own contribution on the home front or whatever. I grew up reading comics that were rooted in the Second World War. The Victor, the Hotspur, the Warlord, they all told stories about the Second World War. So even in that way, there was a context that I understood, which was not available by the time it came to my children, who grew up with comics that were full of Japanese anime or whatever. And I know that if they have children, they will doubtless look at me blankly and say, "Comics? What are you talking about?" But as we get further from the lived experience, as those who did survive the Holocaust and those who did serve in the Second World War become more and more rare, moments like this become more and more important. And as the Right Honourable Lady from Barking said, the work of organisations like the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and the Holocaust Educational Trust, and I pay particular tribute to the work of Karen Pollock in the Holocaust Educational Trust, becomes more and more important. In my own community, in my community that I represent in Shetland, we have our own story to tell on Holocaust Memorial Day. The Shetland bus of a fleet or a progression of small fishing boats that went from Shetland, from Luna, from Scalawa, over to Shetland to take those who were fleeing persecution and whose lives were at risk in Nazi-occupied Norway, bringing them to safety in Shetland and then into the United Kingdom. We talk mostly, when we talk about the Shetland bus, in the work that they did in bringing down Dareman and others. But in fact, it should be remembered that there were no fewer than 350 refugees came to Britain through that route. They were fugitives of the Gestapo. They were not all Jews, but many, many of them were. And indeed, I came across an article from the Jewish Chronicle from 2018, which highlighted a story, an episode that I had never heard until I read this, but I share it with the House because I think it's remarkably potent to think that this is a contribution that my small community, right at the very north of this country, closer to Norway than it is to London, was able to make in that struggle. It records individual stories from individual savings, bring a human face to a brave secret expedition. Just one example is the bus's first loss, Niels Johansen Nessa. After dropping an agent in Bemlo, Norway, Nessa's fishing boat, Siglaus, started the return journey to Shetland in dreadful conditions. Aboard were 7 passengers rescued from Norway, including 3 children. After several hours at sea battling the weather, the Siglaus was attacked by enemy aircraft. Nessa, who held his position at the steering wheel, sustained injuries to the leg and the head. The boat returned safely to Shetland, but Nessa lost his life, aged 23. Today, on a calm day in this picturesque, close-knit harbour town, it's hard to imagine such heroic endeavours taking place. But imagine them we must, because it is part of the history and it's part of what brings us here today. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think we have to recognise the context of today's debate, of what's happening in the world, what's happening in Israel and in Gaza as we speak, because apart from anything else, we know that the Jewish community in this country, or the Jewish communities, I should say, feel so much more at risk and vulnerable than they have ever done as a consequence of what happened on the 7th of October. There is, though, I think, a balance to be struck here. The focus has got to be on what happened. Not to do that risks disrespecting those who perished and those indeed who survived it, but the families for whom it is a lived family experience. But the whole point, surely, as others have said, must be to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And that is why I think when I read stories about a restaurant being opened in Amman, in Jordan, titled the 7th of October, frankly, I despair. You know, I really feel that this is something that has got to be called out and dealt with wherever it happens. So, you know, as somebody who has massive reservations about what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza, and we can debate that on another day, I look with horror and see the incipient anti-Semitism that you find creeping up in so many different ways. Because let's not forget that anti-Semitism, something which is wholly irrational but which we never seem to eradicate, was at the very root of what happened in the Holocaust. So the price of it not happening again is that those of us who care about what happened in the past have got to be honest and open and courageous in calling it out when we see it starting again. If we wait until it has taken hold, then it will be too late.
Bob Stewart.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm going to talk to the House about my own personal experience of genocide. I'm talking about Bosnia, 92-93. I was in Germany, commanding an infantry battalion in 1992 when I rang my mother. And I said, Mum, my camp is beside this ghastly place called Bergen-Belsen. You know, Mum, it's got mounds, rectangular mounds with signs that say, here lie 3,000 bodies. It's heathland. It's a foul place. And she said, I know, Robert. I said, how would you know, Mum? You've never been here with me. She said, I went there in 1945. My mother, in 1945, was a member of the Special Operations Executive in something called the FANI, the First Aid Nursing Unit. It was the uniform they put spies into. And she'd gone there to try and find women who'd been caught by the Germans and put into concentration camps. 17 SOE women were killed, murdered, not executed, murdered. And I said, well, why the heck haven't you told me this before? She never told me she was SOE for a start until a couple of years before that. And she said, because I was ashamed. And I said to her, what do you mean you were ashamed? As soon as you could, you joined up, you learned to parachute, you learned to fight the Germans. You did your bit. And she said, you don't understand. I was ashamed because genocide occurred in my generation and we are all responsible, which is what this is all about. We are all responsible in this world for what happens in this world. And genocide is so easy to happen, so easy. I didn't understand what my mother was talking about until a few months later when I went to Bosnia as the British United Nations commander. There was one hell of a lot of killing around us. And I was appalled. To be honest, I went into a bit of a funk about it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Some of the stuff I saw, I won't repeat. But how about crucifixions on barn doors, people scalped, eyes pulled out with implements that are designed just to do that, women in trees because they've been raped, because they hanged themselves. That's Bosnian Muslims normally. I was horrified. And then I felt what my mother had told me about. Shame. Why had I not been able to stop this? I had soldiers, I had arms, and I was representing the great, mighty world forum of opinion, the United Nations, and yet, near me, women, children, men were being murdered stupidly. They're all South Slavs, they just had different religions. It got worse. Let me just give you the example of Amici. On the 22nd of April 1993, the European Union Commission ambassador asked me to try and stop the battles. I said, how? He said, I'll deal with the politics, you deal with the front lines. I thought, you've got the good deal, mate. Anyway, I went into the front lines. And as I went into the Bosnian Muslim front lines up on the hills above the Lasva Valley, a commander said to me, we are not stopping this battle, because I was trying to stop the battles, ceasefire. We're not stopping this, because at a village called Amici, women and children and men are being massacred. And I said, no, this can't happen. This can't happen this day and age. This is not happening. So I said, well, look, if I go there with my men, and I look, and I discover you're wrong, and I come back, will you stop fighting? They said yes. I came off the hills, went down into the valley. I had with me a platoon, that's about 30 men, 4 armoured vehicles. And I drove along the valley. We got attacked by the Jokers. These were Bosnian Croat special forces, but I just ignored them because it bounced off a bit. And I went into this village. As I went in, the first thing I saw was the minaret, broken. It had been brought down. It was crippled. Then I went all the way through the village, a linear village, about a mile long. I took my men all to the top, and I got to the top, and I said to Alex Watts, the platoon commander, Alex, put a section on either side of the road in sweep position. Let's go down and find out what's happened. I walked down the road with my platoon commander in front of me. We started finding houses that had been destroyed. And then, one house, the soldiers called over to me and said, come and have a look at this. In the doorway was a man and a boy, clearly a boy, teenager. They were dead, they'd been burnt. Then round the back, the men had found a cellar with... When I went in, I was hit first by the smell. Then my eyes focused, and I saw what was in there. It looked like bodies. There were bones and heads. There was a head bent back with its eyes. Oh! I rushed outside and was sick. And I thought, God, how can this happen? And I'm here. UN, the great UN, the people that are meant to police the world. And I failed. I failed. I then had to make a decision. My instructions from the British government, the Minister of Defence, politicians, was that I was neutral. I was not to get involved. This was not my war. I was there purely, guess what? To deliver aid. Just to deliver aid. I thought that was appalling. I think the whole point of the United Nations is to stop people dying. So I extended it a bit and would escort aid, but if people attacked me, I responded pretty robustly. Not me, my men. My men were great. I remember a bandsman. Do you know how we had to clear that up? Do you know what Holocaust means? Do you know what genocide means? It means some poor devil, in this case with shovels, my bandsmen, who were actually medics, my bandsmen had to clean that up. And why did I choose the band to do that? Because they were slightly older than most of my men. For some reason, I'm sure people understand, I felt that an 18-year-old shouldn't be involved in clearing up bodies, but a chap in their mid-20s, perhaps married, with some sort of sanity rather than an 18-year-old lunatic. You know, I don't mean lunatic, I mean, boy with all the testosterone in him. And girls, by the way, I had girls. Women, sorry, wrong term these days. Can't be a girl if you're over 14, I'm told by the course I went on. They were the wrong people. But I remember this corporal in the band, and he was shoveling up the remains of a body. And as he did it, "Sir, this is Europe in 1993, not Europe in 1943. He said, "This is appalling." I said, "God, yes, yes." Next day, I found there was a whole family, father, mother, boy, girl. The little girl was about 7. She was holding a puppy. They were all dead. They were all where they'd been shot. They were in a line. And I said, "Oh, gosh, pick them up, take them to the morgue." We did that. We took them to a morgue. It was horrific. Can you imagine what it's like for our soldiers seeing this? Because all they see is their own family, their sisters. So we took this family to the morgue, and I thought, well, that's it, done. Next day I went down that road again. Guess what? The family were back in front of their house. Guess what? Further. Wrong morgue. They were Muslims. I'd taken them to the Croat morgue. I just couldn't believe it. We then had the problem of what we do with the bodies. No one was going to deal with the bodies. It was nothing to do with me. I was not meant to get involved in the war. But I couldn't because of the disease, you know, the smell, the disease. So I got my Royal Engineers, lovely blokes, I got them to dig a big pit. And we did a mass grave. We put about 100 bodies into this pit. And even then we got that wrong. No one had taught me how to make mass graves. We put people in the plastic bags that we put them into the pit, until the International Committee of the Red Cross delegate came along, who happened to have been my wife at the moment, came along and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I said, "Well, I'm burying people." She said, "You're not burying them in plastic bags. That's not how you do it." So she led, and my men emptied the bodies out. Horrendous. Now, this happened in Europe. And as the Right Honourable Member for Barking has said, watch out, because it happens elsewhere. This happened in Europe. And we couldn't understand it. When we talk about the Holocaust Memorial theme being fragility, I call it the fragility of decency. People's decency can rapidly be shattered. After all these people that I saw were normal human beings. I don't know why. I thought, to hell with this. I picked up my satellite phone and rang the Security Council of the United Nations from Bosnia. And I said, "Can I get through to the operations room?" And I got through to the operations room. And I said, "The Security Council is visiting Bosnia next week. Come and see what's happening out in my area." I didn't think anything of it. And then next week they arrived, and I got told, "The Security Council of the United Nations is coming to visit you." I thought, my God, I must be important. Of course I wasn't. But what they did, they came. And I remember talking to the Argentinian Security Council member, and I said to him, "Look, sir, we've got to do something about this. This is genocide." They refused to accept it as genocide for several years. I always called it genocide. It was called crimes against humanity. Well, genocide's definition is very simple. It's fundamentally trying to eliminate a group of people for being a group of people that's separate. He said, "I totally agree." The Security Council of the United Nations set up the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Republic of Yugoslavia within a month. I have given evidence in 4 trials at the ICTY. I have given evidence that was difficult. My men found it difficult. Your soldiers find it difficult. But if there is a theme this year, it's just about runs along the same lines as that forever. Genocide occurred, not just in the Second World War, by the way. It extended back well into the 20s, and it's occurred repeatedly since. Our job is to highlight the fact that it has occurred. Our job is to make sure that we shout loudly that genocide has occurred in the past, and we like to think it won't occur in the future, but it damn well will. But let us try and lessen the instances of genocide by shouting as loudly as we can, "Never again." Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Lynn Brown.
Wow, what an honour and a privilege it is to be able to follow the honourable and gallant gentleman. I know that he takes this opportunity every year to remind us that the kind of barbarity that he saw is ever present in our world, and that the only thing to do is to try to bring an attention to it and to stop it from happening again. And I'm grateful to him, truly grateful to him, for his personal testimony. Can I also thank my honourable friend, the member for Barking. What a privilege it was to listen to her speech too, and so grateful to her for talking to us about her experiences and the lessons that she and we must draw from those experiences. There was so much that she said that was absolutely spot on, but she is absolutely spot on that the language we use today truly matters, and I'm grateful to her. Can I also join colleagues by expressing my gratitude to the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and to the Holocaust Educational Trust for the amazing, extraordinary and dedicated work that they do. At a time when hatred and mistrust are surging, this work is so important, and it is more important than ever. When I reflect upon the Holocaust, I just simply marvel with horror at how ordinary people could herd children, toddlers, babes in the arms, women, elderly people, the infirm, into a gas chamber to kill them. Such an industrial slaughter of human beings, vulnerable human beings, tots that we, in a normal course of the world, would do our utmost to protect, whether they be ours or not. I just fail to comprehend what made ordinary people act in that way. I fail to comprehend the scale and the depravity of the Holocaust. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda, and so if honourable members would allow, I'd like to give a voice to the testimony of Theresa, one of the survivors of that atrocity, and I want to put it into the parliamentary record today. Before the genocide, Theresa lived with her husband and her 5 children. Her husband had a good job as a customs officer, and she opened up her own business, running a bar from the side of their home. They were happy. Her husband would always come home with presents for the children, and they would go out together to the lake, and they had fun. They weren't rich, but they were happy. For years before the genocide, though, hatred and suspicion had been growing. Words, fuelled by divisive politicians and media incitement. Theresa, obviously, she heard those rumours that were being spread, and she heard rumours that her husband was a supporter of the rebels. Discrimination and segregation started to take hold, with shops refusing to serve the Tutsis, and even some churches refusing to offer Tutsis the Eucharist. Her husband was scared, but even when trouble was being stirred up in the years before 1994, Theresa felt protected. Her Hutu neighbours sometimes drank at her bar, ate her praised chicken, and they called her Grandma. Theresa's Hutu housekeeper promised to protect her. But prejudice against Tutsi people was strong, and the dehumanising bile spread over the radio was powerful enough to turn those same neighbours into killers, into rapists and into torturers. When the genocide began, Theresa tried to continue with her normal life. But on the 3rd day of the genocide, she and her children fled, but her husband was captured and beaten, and she was forced to return home. Her injured husband was sat in a chair in the living room. Theresa and her daughters were forced to take off their clothes. The housekeeper, who had promised to protect them, was the first to take part in their rape. Theresa's eldest son was called Alan, and she remembers him as the model child. Clever, great future in front of him. Alan tried to stop the rape, but the men beat and they slashed him until he died. And then they threw him behind the chair. They raped Theresa, and then her daughters. They slashed her breast and they mutilated her. Her husband was forced to watch this nightmare, terribly injured from blows with hammers and nailed clubs. He didn't die until the next day. And on the third day of their torment, the militia brought a community officer with them. She took away the children, supposedly for protection. But Theresa had heard the men joking that actually the girls would soon become their wives. Theresa was left in a home that had become a living hell, with the corpses of her husband and her son. Neighbours coming to the house to loot it simply ignored her plight, stepping over her, even stepping on her. Miraculously, Theresa's 4 younger children survived. The 2 youngest, Innocent and Eric, were taken in and hidden by a neighbour after being removed from the house. The older girls, Aline and Tina, were found alive in the capital, Kigali, after the war. But as we know, survival does not mean an end to suffering. Theresa, Aline and Tina all fell pregnant as a result of the rape, and they were subjected to, and they were infected by HIV at a time when medicine was extremely scarce. Aline's own testimony tells how she was raped countless times after being taken away from her mother and from their home. Not only that, but after their return, as the only surviving Tutsis from their village, Aline endured further torment from the taunts of neighbours who spread rumours about how she had been infected. At the time of the genocide, Aline was 14 years old. When she told her story, later at the age of 25, she was living in despair, while her rapists now lived happily with families and children. In her words, "I have no future, I have no life." To be honest, I struggle to imagine how anybody could endure such trauma and cope with the mental and physical scars of that ordeal. As we know, so many others endured these terrible experiences, and as many as 1 million Rwandans were murdered in less than 100 days. The scale is truly shocking, and there are so many appalling echoes of the Holocaust in what was done to Theresa, her family, and the hundreds of thousands of others. Of course there are differences, but like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide was built on decades of institutionalised racism. Like the Holocaust, it was fuelled by dehumanising propaganda. Like the Holocaust, it was organised and systematic in its brutality. And like the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda was perpetrated, collaborated with, and resisted by ordinary people. Ordinary people like Theresa's neighbours, who saw what was happening and made horrifying choices about how to respond. Unlike the Holocaust, this happened in most of our lifetimes, just 30 years ago. Never Again rang hollow in 1994. In truth, I fear, it rings hollow again today. Andrew Percy.
Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable lady who has reminded us of the importance of the experiences of Rwanda, and just as there were echoes of the Holocaust in Rwanda, as she was telling sharing with us the testimony of that particular family in Rwanda, there were echoes to what happened to some of the people on the October 7th attacks, of breasts slashed, people raped, and brutality taking place in front of families. So I thank her for that. When I used to deliver Holocaust education as a secondary school history teacher, I used to put up pictures to my students of the Holocaust, of those appalling scenes that we all know too well. We used to show the video footage, the pictures of the gas chambers, the bodies piled high of murdered Jews. And never did I think I would have an experience in my lifetime of visiting a site of a pogrom and of smelling the rotting flesh of those of Jewish people who had been murdered. And that's something that happened for me 3.5 weeks after October the 7th, when I visited Israel with my honourable friend, the member for Hendon. And I think that is a memory that trip will live with all of us. I said in my 14 years here, I've done a number of parliamentary trips. There was never a visit I have undertaken which has been more important to me and to me in my lifetime, not just as a member of Parliament. We visited Kfar Ezar, which the kibbutz, which the Right Honourable Lady spoke about, founded by peaceniks, led by a peace-loving leader who was also the chair of the regional council, who was picked out and shot by Hamas fighters on his own doorstep, specifically because of his leadership of that peaceful kibbutz. At that time, you could still smell the blood and the flesh that was still rotting in that community. And as my own friend for Hendon will attest, we also visited the base where the bodies were being identified, or should I say the body parts. And I don't think either of us will forget the emotions we felt when the doors were opened to where the bodies were being kept in the refrigerators, and that wave of the smell coming towards us was just truly shocking. And I never thought, as I said in my time having delivered education on the Holocaust, that I would bear testimony and see the bodies and smell murdered Jews, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was a truly horrendous visit, but one I am very proud to have made, and pleased to at least come back here and share that experience. And when I delivered that education to my Year 9 students on the Holocaust, what did I teach them about? I taught them about boycotts. I taught them about how people were told not to buy Jewish goods, good Jewish products, how Jewish community facilities, synagogues were attacked. I taught them how Jews used to huddle in dark spaces. They were held in captivity against their will. How they had people shouting on the streets for the death of Jews. I taught them how children had been indoctrinated with hate against the children of Israel. And I'm afraid all of that is what we're seeing today across large parts of our own country, and indeed across the West. We see Jewish products in shops attacked now. We've seen Jewish schools in Canada shot at, not on one occasion, on 2 occasions. We've seen Jewish businesses torched in other parts of the West. And of course, we've had marches on our own streets where people have called for the death of Jews. It's the same message, but it's a different era. It's not the brown shirts of the Nazis on our streets or on the streets of Europe parading through, screaming and shouting that a society needs to be cleansed of Jews. They've been replaced by, I'm afraid to say, hard left activists, associated useful idiots, I think useful idiots is a polite way of describing them, calling for a socialist intifada. They're joined by progressives, by LGBT groups, by feminists who wouldn't last a second in Hamas-controlled Gaza. The cries of Jews are our misfortune have been replaced on our streets by calls for jihad, calls for an intifada and demands for Muslim armies to rise up to fight Israel. And it's no longer Nazis crossing international borders to murder and round up Jews. It's Islamist extremists in Hamas, in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and of course Hezbollah if they had their way. And these are groups that are as clear in their intentions to commit a genocide against the Jewish people as Adolf Hitler was in his ramblings. That's not to say we don't have a problem still with far-right anti-Semitism and far-right racism. Of course we do. Of course we do. But it has now been joined by these sinister groups and alliances of Islamist extremists and hard left activists. And what was the response to the atrocities on October the 7th by some of these people? Not to come out in sympathy with the events, with that pogrom. It was to stand outside the Israeli embassy within hours demanding boycotts of the state of Israel. And I'm afraid to say, as I've called out before, even in this place there have been people who have spent a lot of time on their feet criticising the response to the atrocities of October the 7th and not a lot of time condemning some of those actions. We've seen it in the media, in civil society. We've had football pundits, actors who've never uttered a word about Yemen, about the 85,000 children killed in Yemen, never uttered a word about Sudan and the millions of people displaced, but they find time to add their voices and offer us some commentary on Israel, sometimes promoting in those comments ancient blood libels. We had it even with members in this place tweeting about an attack on a hospital which never took place, a blood libel, Jewish bloodlust. That's what that feeds into. Some of them never apologise for that, of course. We've even had yesterday somebody accusing the Prime Minister of having blood on his hands. Who has blood on their hands for October the 7th? It's Hamas. It's the thousands of civilians who followed those fighters into Kibbutz Kafar Azar, Kibbutz Be'eri and other communities and stepped over the bodies of murdered Jews to loot and pillage the homes of those people. That's who has blood on their hands, and some people in this place would do well to remember that. I've been attacked for daring to call out people for giving a free pass. I'll continue to do that. It doesn't bother me, the bile and hate that came at me as a result of that, including people targeting my post on Holocaust Memorial Day with words such as Zionist scum. I'm a proud Zionist. I've never been prouder to be a Jew, never been prouder to be a Zionist. People attacking my Facebook page, telling me about the Zionist rat hostages, somebody telling me nobody cares about the Jews, all because I dared to call out in this place and speak freely, as I thought I had a right to do in this chamber, that I thought some people, when not contextualising the response of Israel into the events of October the 7th, we're giving a free pass to terrorists. But I'll go on doing that because I won't be silenced by those who seek to bully me. Members who otherwise, and members of the community who otherwise would be screaming and shouting about the gender-based violence that took place on October the 7th, not a peep, not a word. And why? Why not a word? Is it just the pressure of people's inboxes? Is it something deeper, something more sinister? I don't know, but I find it hard to understand how this is not called out. Why this gender-based violence is not an outrage. Why don't we have young people on the streets of this country marching against what happened to those young Jewish women on October the 7th? The most brutal, brutal rapes, breasts sliced off, people shot and then raped, necrophilia, and underage girls subjected to the most appalling abuse. But look at our streets. What do we have? We've got Nazi and Soviet-era propaganda marching down our streets, and it's not being tackled. The police stand by as people call for jihad. They say it's about context. The anti-Zionist stuff on our streets is directly out of the Soviet propaganda playbook. which in itself drew heavily on the Nazi propaganda. Look what's happening in our schools. I raised in Prime Minister's questions just a couple of weeks ago, letters produced in schools in this country by pupils, which included phrases such as, "I don't believe all Jews are bad," and which included a phrase challenging a member of Parliament for why they had believed the Western media narrative that Hamas were a terrorist organisation. Where's that coming from? It's not coming from the school. It's coming from within communities in this country. We've got flags put up illegally in this country that will not be brought down in Jewish areas. The flags which, by the way, was the flag that I've watched, many of us have in this place, the 47-minute video of the slaughter of people on October the 7th, the flag that was proudly displayed on the breasts and lapels of Hamas fighters, not removed in Jewish areas because people are scared. The council's scared to remove them, can't guarantee the safety of people taking them down. Can you imagine if we had swastikas up? How long would they last? I'm not comparing the two flags, of course not. What I'm saying is that in a Jewish area where there have been concerns raised about these triggering incidents, something that would be so triggering in a different way would, of course, be dealt with very quickly. And we've seen this, as I've said, across the West. So what do I want from my government? What do I want from this country? I wanted to stand up for the values I thought it stood for. I want that to be the right to have a different view without being subjected to threats of violence. And I know many members of Parliament, for having a different view on this, have had their offices targeted, have had their inboxes targeted, have been threatened. That's not the values of Britain. The values of Britain is that we allow people and we respect people having a different view. And that's what I want my government to protect. I want to feel safe on the streets. I want Jewish people in this country to feel safe coming into central London on a weekend, as they do not at this present time. I want our democratic values defended. And I want to live in a country where children are not brainwashed with hate, whether that is hate against Jews, hate against members of the Muslim community, or any hate. I want a government and our institutions that stands up and says that's not acceptable and we're going to do something about it. Not just stand up and say, oh, we all condemn it, but actually do something about it. I've never, as I leave Parliament this year, have never felt more ashamed or sadder about the state of some of our institutions and about our democracy and about the right of people in this country to express their views freely without fear of being subject to violence or threats of violence. And that's what's happening currently on our streets. It's happened on other issues as well, and it's dangerous. I wanted to, in the time I had, make reference to two Holocaust survivors I met this week. One was Eve Kugler, who spoke at the Foreign Office event this week, where she told us, and she gave us examples which we're all too familiar to today, of growing up in Germany and of experiencing Kristallnacht herself. Her father being taken off to Buchenwald, but fortunately the whole family eventually being able to escape. But as she told us her story and gave us her testimony, so much of it rings true today with regards to boycotts, smashing of Jewish businesses and all the rest. I also wanted to mention briefly John Hodge, who was another survivor I met this week, who was born into a Jewish family in Budapest in Hungary in 1937. He shared his experience with me of how he had to hide in a cupboard when a non-Jewish neighbour hid him. Again, rings true of October the 7th as well, where Jewish children on those kibbutzim were hidden in cupboards. Didn't save some of them, of course. After hiding, John was eventually forced to live in the ghetto. Those who were not taken to concentration camps were forced into about 290 buildings, where at least 20 people lived in an overcrowded flat. He describes the situation there as pretty grim, as you can imagine, and his experience was horrific, but fortunately, during the liberation of Budapest, he was freed minutes before the ghetto was about to be blown up. And as I recounted those two stories, it made me think that John and Eve at least have one fortunate thing that some of the people who were affected by October the 7th don't have. They lived to tell their story. And right now, in Gaza, there are Jewish people who don't have a voice, who can't tell their story. And those are the 136 hostages who still remain. And in the brief time I have, I would just like to name a few of those hostages. I would like to name all 111, but I appreciate that that's not going to be possible today. But I think particularly of Liri Albag, Karina Ariev, Noah Agamani, who you will remember was the young girl on the motorbike, seen with her pleading to her boyfriend as she was whisked away into Gaza. Her mother is dying, wants her daughter home. Hamas refused to release her. I think of Romy Gonen, Carmel Gatz, Inbar Heyman, Judy Weinstein, Abu Yehud, Goran Meyer, Doran Steinbrecher, Daniela Gilboa, 19 years old, Nama Levy, 19 years old, Agam Berger, 19 years old, all women held currently by Hamas. I think of the Bibas family, the ginger-haired family, if you remember the two ginger-haired, the little baby who would now be a year old, turned a year old in captivity, and his parents, and of course his brother Ariel. I think of Irma Shem Tov, 21-year-old Israeli at the Nova Music Festival, who I met his mother in early November, desperate for news about her son, utterly distraught. He has no voice today, of course, in this place, as do so many others. I think of Abraham Cooper, 85 years old, Odin Lifshitz, 83, Gadi Moses, 79, Shlomo Mansour, 85. People who are not too different to my parents' ages. They should be at home with their families, enjoying the peaceful life of their retirement and their dotage. And of course, it's not just Israelis who are held. Baipan Joshi is a Nepalese citizen, Avira Mengistu, a Tanzanian. And there are so many other names I wish I could mention today. Shlomo Ziv, Saki Yadan, Matan Zangauka, Andrei Kozlov, Ohad Ben Ami, Sahar Baruch, Oriel Baruch, Ziv Berman, Gali Berman, Ron Braslavsky. But of course, I can't name them all today. But as I end my contribution today, these are the people I will be thinking about, the Jews who do not have a voice, Jews who have been held again, as Jews were held 80, 90 years ago, in dark tunnels, in cupboards, in cages, as we've heard. How is this happening again? 2024 now. And here we are again, Jew hate, which never really went away, manifesting itself for all to see in all of its gory, disgusting detail.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member from Brigg and Goole, and I thank the Right Honourable Members for Barking and Orkney and Shetland for securing this debate today and allowing us to talk about something which has always been important in this House. Holocaust Memorial Day has always been the day in which we remember and we recommit ourselves to ensuring that the Holocaust does not happen again. But I think this year it's particularly important that we are aware of that. And two things have happened to me personally since the last time I spoke in one of these debates. I am, like the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland, of that generation for whom the Holocaust was always history, which we were told about by our parents who'd been children during the war and had heard about. We had no personal experience of it, but the information about it, the knowledge about it, was everywhere. It was in comics, it was in films that we saw, books that we read, everything from the Diary of Anne Frank to Schindler's List, and we were aware of it. But actually we didn't believe that it would ever happen again, that it could ever happen again, because we wouldn't let it happen again, and it would never have happened in this country anyway, because we wouldn't let it happen. But since October the 7th, I have become increasingly worried that we're just a fraction complacent in this country about the dangers. That anything like the Holocaust, like Darfur, like Cambodia, could happen here. Just over a year ago, I went to see Good with David Tennant in the West End, and it's an absolutely wonderful play. It's about a good, liberally minded academic whose best friend is Jewish and who lives in pre-war Germany. And he becomes complacent about the Nazis and what they're doing, and he gradually becomes seduced and involved, and it has a cataclysmic ending. And the other thing that's happened was hearing the first reports of what was happening in Israel on October the 7th as I was in a taxi on my way to the airport to fly out to a friend's wedding in Spain. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what's happening? This is horrific. And I had no idea of what was to follow. And then, a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a handful of students at Glasgow University, and we were talking about various issues on campus. And they told me that they had been to a debate about an international chain of coffee shops, which happened to have one just off campus. And they were there, and it was all very civilised and a chat and a strong debate. And then one of the students who was Jewish told me that one of the other students said, but it's only Jews that go there anyway. And I was utterly horrified that a comment like that could be made in a meeting of young people in this country. And it's not the only example. I visited the synagogue in Edinburgh recently, and I heard the concern there from ordinary people of what they are experiencing every day. The Jewish Students' Association at Edinburgh University is one of the largest and fastest growing in the country, but they feel completely isolated. Jewish students have written to associations across the country, to every university, asking for support against the anti-Semitism which they see creeping into their daily lives. And only a handful replied.
What's to give way?
Certainly.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder if she would agree with me whether the answer to this is for people to engage with the lived experience of Jewish people and to understand the profound effect it has on their lives. My constituent, Natalie Cumming, has written about the experience of her family fleeing persecution both in Russia and a horrifying experience of her sister who survived Auschwitz and whose story she retells in her book. And having read the book, which is one of the most difficult reads of my life, I think people need to engage with the stories and understand so that they don't repeat this kind of prejudice going forward.
I thank the honourable member. She is absolutely right. It is about engaging with those experiences, listening to them, hearing them, engaging with the experiences of Holocaust survivors, hearing, as we did at the Speaker's ceremony earlier this week, the direct relating of tales, because we now find that surveys in America have discovered that 20% of young Americans do not believe that the Holocaust actually happened. And another, something like 30%, believe it's actually exaggerated. It was a minor event. We are in a very dangerous position at the moment. Anti-Semitism is creeping in everywhere. We are hearing of it every day from people who are finding that it is becoming part of their daily experience, and we're not aware of it. And we're all good, liberally minded, intelligent people. How easy it would be for us just to get drawn in and not realise what is happening around us, to let it happen. And by the time we notice, it would be too late. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a few years ago I visited Yad Vashem in Israel, the Holocaust Memorial. And one of the things that struck me about that is it's built on the hillside. And it's dark, it's scary, it's depressing. You hear the tales, you see the remnants of people's lives that were destroyed by the Holocaust. And it has an oppressive feel to it. But as you move towards the end of it, you see the light at the end of the tunnel. And you come out to a breathtaking view of Israel. Mr Deputy Speaker, at the moment I feel that we are truly in that dark spot. And we have to make sure that we do not get trapped and pulled in further and that anti-Semitism becomes accepted in this country. We have to remember the light at the end of the tunnel and strive for that. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Very much. Sir Paul Beresford.
Deputy Speaker, I absolutely, totally agree with the Honourable Lady of Edinburgh West, and I'm a bit shocked by it because it's come upon me. As a teenager, I lived in a little village in the north of the South Island in New Zealand. It was a prosperous area, agriculture, and it was a mecca for European immigrants. They flooded into the area. The schools were co-educational, multiracial. There was plenty of schoolboy spats, especially spats on the rugby field, as you can imagine. But I do not remember any racial aggravation at all. Now, most of the men of my parents' generation were involved in the Second World War. Almost all of those served overseas from New Zealand. And when they came back, some of them told stories, including some of the horrific ones we've heard today. And like a typical teenage boy, I got fascinated. I haunted the village library for appropriate books. Inevitably, in reading these books, I read the books on the Nuremberg trials and association. To say I was mortally horrified would be one of the biggest understatements ever. And this was probably capped in 1982 when I saw a full-screen film, Sophie's Choice. As a father, that scene of the Gestapo officer walking the wee girl away is the stuff of nightmares that any parent would have scarred on them. Mr Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom medical and dental profession is very multiracial. A lot of people from the Middle East, but also includes many Jewish people. Some I rank as not just colleagues, but as friends. Many amongst the best of the profession. They have lists of achievements behind their name that goes on across the whole page. Most of them live in North London. Periodically, they have made me aware of the progressive rise of what I saw as irrational anti-Semitic abuse, sometimes associated with violent activity. The activity and violence increased in the run-up to the last election and then seemed to dull down a bit. To me, however, the Hamas outrage on the 7th of October, 12,000 women, men and children raped, tortured, murdered, beheaded, and some 240 hostages, I saw lit the fire again. For many of us, this is the stuff of horror, but it's been submerged in a rise of these attacks on Jewish people, including the professional Jewish people in our community. These people have nothing to do or say in what Israel does to Hamas. But what's happening to them is a complete disgrace, with hints of the early days of the Nazis in Germany. The attacks are frightening, and most viciously, and I had this explained to me by a very superior, top-notch dental practitioner, an expert on a number of key things, who is treating children. She had tears in her eyes as she was telling me on Tuesday night of the attack on social media. And that attack is coming on special social media for the profession. So you would assume that every single person writing on that was intelligent, was educated, and yet the vile abuse that is coming on there is ghastly. And we're being asked, and I hope we do reflect, as many have said, that this could be the thin edge of the wedge. It must not happen again.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you. Mr Deputy Speaker, I grew up in a household where it was common to hear family members discuss World War II. I knew about Hitler, the Sudetenland, Neville Chamberlain, Winston Churchill. I'd heard about Barnes Wallis and the Dam Busters. But to my shame, I have to say I was an adult in full-time employment before I began to understand the meaning of the Holocaust. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for Barking for securing today's debate and for her personal testament. And I also want to commend the other speeches we've heard today, and in particular the contribution of the honourable member for Beckenham. My education has been assisted by a few very specific things. One has been the work of the Holocaust Educational Trust. I'll never forget going with a group of sixth formers from a local school to Auschwitz one bitter cold February morning. And I don't know who was more distraught by what we encountered, these young sixth formers or myself, but it was a total education, and it left an impression on me which I'll never forget. I'm also extremely grateful to Scott Saunders, the chairman and founder of March for the Living, who has done so much to help inform and educate people about particularly events in Poland, but also what happened in the concentration camps. And I'm indebted to him for helping me learn that before the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, there were 3.3 million Jews living in Poland. By the end of the war, less than 400,000 of them had survived. I'll give way.
Thank you. My family are one of those families in Poland, and he's made an excellent speech, including highlighting the work of the Holocaust Education Trust. There are now very few survivors left, and I think it's important that we recognise the generation, my father's generation, I went with him and my own children to Auschwitz last year, of their experience, the baby boomer generation, but also independent researchers and organisations like the Wiener Library to bring home what happened to us now that we have that very last of that living testimony. And so we need to encourage all of those, that second generation and that research body, to keep alive Holocaust education.
Yes, my honourable friend's absolutely right. I mean, I think that is something that a theme of today. We must do everything to remember and to preserve that memory so that people don't forget. So I was saying that, I think Scott Saunders was someone else. I also read fairly recently a book by about Witold Pilecki. There have been lots of excellent books about the Holocaust and aspects, but he was the Polish resistance fighter who actually volunteered to go into Auschwitz to gather information about what was happening, which was then given to the Allies, and we chose not to act on it. We were listening earlier in the debate to the fact that maybe we shouldn't always feel so proud of our own record. I think that's another example of where, with hindsight, admittedly, we should have done better. And of course, going back to my honourable friend's point, I suppose the other thing that has really helped me has been listening to the testimonies of Holocaust survivors. They're all amazing people, but two in particular have had an impact on me. Mindu Hornick, MBE, who lives near Birmingham, she was sent to Auschwitz when she was 12 years of age. She never saw her mother or brothers again. And of course, Harry Allner, MBE, who is just an incredible man and an inspiration to anyone who ever meets him. Mr Deputy Speaker, when I hear protests about current events in Gaza, I wonder what we have learned. I deplore the killing and the suffering we're seeing there. I want a ceasefire and an end to the killing and an enduring peace and a two-state solution with Palestinians and Israelis living side by side in recognised and secure independent states. I want that as much as anyone else. But I struggle when I hear marchers, demonstrators and protesters chant ceasefire now in one breath and from the river to the sea in the next. What are they saying? What have they learned? And what are they advocating? Now, some know very well what they're doing, but others need to stop and spend a little more time on learning the lessons of the past. They need to reflect on how little their behaviour shows a desire for peace and how much it's encouraging division and hatred. And I also wonder at the genuinely concerned people who contact me about the deaths and suffering in Gaza, but skip over the October 7th attack, who with ease use terms like war crimes and genocide to condemn Israel and the Israelis, but seem to have overlooked an attack on Israeli civilians based on torture, mutilation, rape, murder and hostage taking. Some even tell me that the Hamas attack needs to be understood because of Israel's previous behaviour. They usually show little knowledge that Israel pulled out of Gaza and removed all its settlements there in 2005 in accordance with the peace accords, and were promised in return a demilitarised Gaza that could become something like a Singapore of the Middle East. 2 years later, Hamas took over Gaza, and it's been a launch pad for attacks on Israel ever since. The Nazis took people in. They used excuses and demands. They talked about the suffering of the German people. They blamed the Jews. They offered seemingly plausible explanations for their actions, and they lied about their intentions while laying plans to exterminate 6 million people. I am, and I always will be, a friend of Israel and the Israeli people. I'm not a fan of the current Prime Minister, and I totally disagree with him and others who oppose a two-state solution. I believe such views are an obstacle to peace, and that their attitudes and behaviour risk giving succour to those who oppose the very existence of the Jewish state. But I won't accept the blaming of the entirety of the Jewish people for things I dislike, and I won't demand higher standards of the world's only Jewish state than we do of any other nation. We need to remember the Holocaust, the way seemingly decent people resorted to cowardly, wicked and savage behaviour designed to wipe out the Jewish people. Those who shout for peace and ceasefires, but not peace and reconciliation, have not learned those lessons, and their shrill cries and disruption of meetings and events organised by those who won't support them are dishonest and irrational, and show how much more we need to strive to learn the lessons of history and why we can't ever afford to ignore real genocide and the events of the Holocaust.
Order. Royal Assent. I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that His Majesty has signified his royal assent to the following acts and measures: Post Office Horizon System Compensation Act 2024, Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act 2024, Church of England Miscellaneous Provisions Measure 2024, Church of England Pensions Application of Capital Funds Measure 2024. Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and an honour to follow my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Selly, and I just want to thank him for his commitment to the Jewish community in Birmingham and his commitment to Israel. I know it's deeply appreciated. Mr Deputy Speaker, I've sometimes thought that I've struggled to grasp the scale of the Holocaust, because every time you hear someone's testimony, you think you understand what the Holocaust was, but it's always only a tiny fraction of it. Every story in the Holocaust is completely unique. Different factors of testimonies include the country they were born in, where they were made to move when tensions started to rise in Europe, where or how they managed to hide, how they were rounded up, what happened to their friends and family, and then stories differ by how they watched their parents being murdered, how they cared for younger loved ones, how they got by, how snap decisions they made saved the lives of themselves or others. The Holocaust is the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women and children, but it was so much more than that. The number 6 million is huge, and on its own it doesn't encompass the true scale of suffering. It's millions of people that didn't get the opportunity to wake up in the morning in their homes and feel safe. It's millions of people who didn't have the privilege of making everyday normal decisions, get married, start a family, go to school, have a career. It tore humanity apart and stole the future for 6 million Jews and their future families. 7th of October wasn't on the same scale. It wasn't over the same long period of time. It wasn't carried out by the same perpetrators. It wasn't even on the same continent. But the 7th of October was the biggest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust. On Tuesday, I met a delegation of family members of hostages with the leader of the House. A brave 23-year-old told us she lost 60 friends on the 7th of October. Can anyone imagine losing 60 friends in one day? Sadly, many Jewish families know what that feels like. Mr Deputy Speaker, I've really struggled with this. There are accusations of genocide thrown around too frequently, and I'm the last person who would ever wish to draw comparisons with the Holocaust. And as the noble Lord Pickles from the other place said earlier this week, there can be no comparison with the Holocaust. We now have the Jewish state, and that was designed to ensure history doesn't repeat itself. It was born out of the need to do just that. But it is true that the 7th of October was the largest murder of Jewish people since the Holocaust, and sadly the comparisons don't end there. I visited Israel at the beginning of the year, and I had the chance to visit the exhibition survivors of the Nova Festival have created. It was heartbreaking. On tables lay shoes, clothing and items of ordinary festival goers who just went to dance. I couldn't help but see the table of shoes and be reminded of the pile of shoes in Auschwitz. Except for laying next to this table of clothes and shoes was makeup, the kind of makeup that I use. In Auschwitz, you see the personal items that make you wonder what that person might have looked like or how they might have lived. When I saw brands like L'Oreal, I didn't have to think about that. I knew exactly how they looked and how they might have lived. I know exactly what they were doing on that fateful day that their life ended. I know they weren't any different to me, a young woman in their 20s or 30s. They were doing what normal young people around the world should do. They were dancing. I'd hoped my visit would help me understand how the attack happened, maybe the true motives. I think it's probably part of the natural human mind and reaction to try and make something so huge and terrifying make more sense. I heard stories about families murdered in a kibbutz. We visited Kfar Zar. We heard about a mayor who will never stand for re-election because he bravely tried to defend his community. about the young couple who were going to get engaged, how they text their parents in the last moments of their lives before being slaughtered. I heard about a teacher set on fire in her house. I watched 47 minutes of this footage. Until then, some of the most disturbing images I'd ever seen was during the Holocaust, images of bodies strewn across Bergen-Belsen upon liberation. But I'd never known what a body looks like after being tortured, shot in the head, or burnt until the only thing left is their teeth. I've seen footage of 2 young boys witnessing the brutal death of their father. I wondered, how did they survive? Why did the terrorists so calmly help themselves to a drink from their fridge while they screamed? Why weren't they taken as hostages? Why were other children taken as hostage? Why were other children and babies murdered without a chance? The events on the 7th of October started with rockets, followed by a massacre at a music festival. They slaughtered people one by one, setting cars alight, raping women and girls, throwing grenades into bomb shelters. And it didn't end there. They went hunting for soldiers in military bases, raped more women, murdered more people, took more hostages. They went house to house, having already identified who lived where. And Hamas enjoyed every second of it, even boasted in calls to parents that they'd killed at least 10 Jews. No 2 stories from the 7th of October are the same. I got the feeling of being completely overwhelmed by trying to grasp the scale, and the scale of the fear. And if I'm confused now, how must they have felt on that day and every day since? I never believed I would use today as an opportunity to talk about something other than the Holocaust. I firmly believe that is what today is for. There are 364 other days in the year to talk about everything else. But I also know what Holocaust survivors today are thinking, and can only begin to imagine how they are feeling. They have dedicated their lives to telling their stories, and much like the survivors of the 7th of October, are now doing. And they're furious that the 7th of October happened. It was never meant to happen again. Every year we stand here and say, never again. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we also rightly label those who seek to distort or deny the Holocaust ever happening as anti-Semites. They have the evidence and plenty of it, but to them facts don't matter because they believe they have a deeper understanding, an understanding that is born out of a hatred for Jews. Holocaust denial is anti-Semitic. So what about those thousands who don't believe the 7th of October happened? They don't believe women were raped. They argue about how many babies' heads were cut off or if they were at all. Some who have kindly written to me tell me the 7th of October was actually carried out by Israel. That's if it happened at all. Recounting my own witnessing of 47 minutes of death and destruction makes no difference to their view. One theory within Holocaust denial is that the Holocaust was carried out by European Jews, and some believe Nazis and Zionists worked together in partnership. And as a result of having scammed the world, the State of Israel was born. This theory features in a book called The Other Side, The Secret Relationship Between Nazism and Zionism, written by President Mahmoud Abbas in 1984. The same theory, but set in 2023, is now gaining traction on social media, particularly amongst young people. They believe the 7th of October was carried out by Israel to legitimise military action against Hamas, or that Israel has been funding Hamas, or that Israel are exaggerating claims of the death and destruction at the hands of Hamas. What is this theory at its core? You tell me. I'm not even going to ask that we say one final time in this place today, never again, before we make it a reality. I'm going to say instead, understand what has happened to the Jewish people in October last year and since. The largest increase in anti-Semitic incidents on record is in response to the largest murder of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Chief Rabbi Sir Ephraim Mervis last week made an important intervention. He said claiming Israel is carrying out a genocide is a moral inversion which undermines the memory of the worst crimes in human history. He said it's a term deployed not only to eradicate any notion that Israel has a responsibility to protect its citizens, but also to tear open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust, knowing that it will inflict more pain than any other accusation. I want to finish by quoting Holocaust survivor Manfred Goldberg, who selflessly has spent so many years educating young people here in the UK about his testimony. He said, "The majority of people in this country are not Jew haters. They are often our silent supporters. and all that it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to stay silent. So on this Holocaust Memorial Day, the day we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered by Nazis, let's also think carefully about the current rise in anti-Semitism, and as individuals, what we are going to do about it. If the 7th of October was a fresh warning to the world about where anti-Semitism can lead, let's remember it is against that backdrop we are seeing record increases in anti-Semitism. None of us can afford to stay silent.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for West Bromwich East, who gave such a testimony of what has happened. I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for Barking for leading off the debate in her customary fashion, telling us the story of her relatives, what they suffered, and indeed reminding us that we should not be comfortable about what happened in the United Kingdom when Jewish survivors arrived. And indeed, I think it's even more important today that we recognise the atrocities that were directed towards the Jewish community both before the Second World War and continue today. I'd like to declare my interest as the co-chairman of the All-Party Group for Israel and also the co-chairman of the Holocaust Memorial site, for which we hope will be erected alongside this place. Now, 79 years on from the end of the Holocaust, we still have people that are persecuting and attacking people based solely on their religion. It's unacceptable, and I'm proud that the government is committed and steadfast in its support for Israel and the wider Jewish diaspora. Now, the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is fragility of freedom, and it's particularly fitting given the unstable position we find ourselves in today all over the globe. Although there will always be mild tensions between communities, we have to remember there's a war waging in Europe, a terror war raging in Israel and Gaza, attacks in the Red Sea, the Sudan war, and growing concerns in the Asian continent itself. Now, I've never felt more grateful to live in this country and work in the heart of a thriving, free and fair democracy. We often take for granted the privileged position of being able to get up in the morning, work in a career of our choosing, and be confident that we're being represented by elected individuals looking to represent our views. We don't fear for our lives every moment of the day or be on a constant alert for potential rockets. Sadly, that cannot be said for the rest of the world's population or even the Jewish population in this country, as my honourable friend, the member for Brigg and Goole, referred. Now, each year, the remarkable survivors of the Holocaust group grow older, and sadly, year by year, their numbers decrease. It's vitally important, therefore, we make a continued conscious effort to learn their stories and learn the true history of the Holocaust, so that we not only let them live on, but also we educate each other to ensure we never allow the same atrocities to occur, ever. Now, I've had the privilege of visiting many of the Holocaust memorial sites across Europe and in Israel over my years in Parliament. Each time I find the most remarkably striking thing to be that despite the abominable and unimaginable conditions the Jewish prisoners had to live through, somehow they maintained hope that liberation would occur. Now, hope is one of the strongest, most determined and powerful attributes a person can possess. Now, many interviews with liberated prisoners from the Nazi concentration camps describe their fellow inmates losing hope and thus sadly passing very quickly thereafter. Without hope, they lost purpose and died. I recount from a book I read, there was a rumour around one of the camps that they would be released on a specific date in 1942. The prisoners held on for this bit of hope for several years until, several days before the alleged release date, they realised it was a malicious lie from the Nazis. A prisoner recounts how, almost instantaneously, many of those disheartened people died. For them, their hope was over, and they could no longer hang on. Now, last week, the temperatures around London plummeted, and when I left home during the week, last week, my car thermometer was regularly reading -1 or even lower. I was lucky to be wrapped up in my hat, scarf and coat, but I could still feel the bitter cold. This puts into perspective how harsh the conditions were for the people in the camps, with temperatures reaching -10 and below on a frequent basis and blankets of snow covering the camps. Now imagine that, with minimal clothing, bare feet and bodies of skin and bone. Frankly, unbearable. To then be physically and psychologically tortured on a daily basis astounds me how people never gave up and remained hopeful that one day they'd be free. Now, I have an overwhelming amount of respect for the survivors of the Holocaust, who so importantly and bravely share and recount their stories over and over for the benefit of others. To live through these circumstances and then be brave enough to share them on a continuous basis with others is a phenomenal feat, but crucially important. Now, anti-Semitism is not new, and it didn't originate with Hitler. Jewish people have been subjected to anti-Semitism throughout Europe since the Middle Ages. The hatred escalated significantly after the Great War, when the reparations on Germany and its allies were extreme. And we had the Wall Street crash, followed by the Depression, leading in turn to rampant inflation in Germany and the collapse of the Weimar Republic. Now, last year, I related some of the challenges that were faced between the wars in this country, particularly on the growth of anti-Semitism. But we should remember that the same thing happened in the United States. And growing from the traditional hostilities of Christianity towards Judaism, Jews have been targeted since the Middle Ages. America was rife with anti-Semitism from the early colonial days. However, they only represented a small part of American society. It remained dormant, and anti-Semitism flourished in the 1880s with the arrival of 2 million Jewish immigrants fleeing Eastern Europe, particularly from parts of the Russian Empire where persecution was frequent. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, conditions for Jews worsened with the passage of more and more restrictive legislation and recurring government-initiated violent attacks against Jewish communities, commonly known as pogroms. Consequently, Jews began fleeing in great numbers to the United States. Now, many Americans originated traditionally from Northwest Europe or Scandinavia, and they grew increasingly anxious about the arrival of mass immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, whom they considered to belong to inferior races and frequently questioned their religious beliefs. Now, we rarely talk about the anti-Semitic movement in America, more often than not concentrating wholly on Nazi Germany. However, it was a grave situation across Europe and specifically in the States. Anti-Semitism became more and more common in almost every aspect of American culture.
Would the Honourable Gentleman give way?
I will.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank my good and honourable friend for giving way. The thing that I struggle with is, what is it that people hate about Jews? What is it? Is it religion? What is it that this comes across the ages? I just don't get it.
I thank my right honourable and gallant friend for that intervention. It is hard to understand blind prejudice, and that's what it is, blind prejudice. Possibly people are fearful of the success of people who strive to do better for themselves, their children and their children's children. That is the only reason I can think that people are jealous of what Jewish people have been able to do solely through their own efforts. But turning back to what happened in the United States, newspapers and magazines were commonly printing anti-Semitic attacks. Racist cartoons, anti-Semites represented high positions in the federal government. Jewish exclusion from social clubs, discrimination in employment opportunities, and many towns adopted zoning regulations to prevent the sale of land and houses to Jews. And from 1922, following the example set by the leading University of Harvard, many prominent educational institutions imposed strict quotas on the number of Jews they allowed to study. Throughout the 1920s, renowned car producer Henry Ford published a weekly newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which attracted an audience of over 700,000 people. He launched a vicious and persistent campaign against the international Jew. He blamed the Jewish community for all that was wrong with society, from threatening the capitalist system to undermining the moral values of the nation. He notably even blamed them for World War I, the Great War. Now, many miles across the globe, this narrative was gaining traction in Germany with the rapid rise of the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. Hitler, of course, was a prominent member of the German Workers' Party following the establishment of the Weimar Republic, often a firm favourite in the party for his engaging and passionate speeches. Throughout the 20s, Hitler would ferociously campaign across Germany, promoting his party's values of anti-communism, anti-Semitism and ultranationalism, appealing to both the left and right of the political spectrum and gaining considerable momentum as a result. Now, the political landscape in Germany took a sharp turn following the Wall Street crash in 1929. The economy slammed to a halt, and the USA loans that were helping repay the Great War reparations soon dried up. The Nazis used this political polarising landscape to exploit the crisis and loudly condemn the ruling government. Slowly but surely, the Nazi Party was gaining more and more support. Now, in 1932, Hitler ran for the presidency but faced defeat to the incumbent Paul von Hindenburg. The Nazi Party, however, became the largest party in the Reichstag, but was still short of an absolute majority. Despite initial hesitations from Hindenburg, Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. Although not yet a dictator, this was a pivotal moment for Hitler and his party. Soon after, the Reichstag was set on fire. Hitler was quick to hold the communists accountable for such actions and persuaded Hindenburg to pass the Reichstag fire decree. This severely curtailed all liberties and rights of German citizens, which Hitler used then to begin eliminating, but first political opponents, and then after that, all those that opposed him. Now, with the groundwork for his dictatorship in firm place, in 1934, following the death of President von Hindenburg, Hitler merged the Chancellery with the presidency, became Führer, the sole leader of Germany. Now, the Nazi persecution of the Jewish community continued, subtly first, but becoming more and more discriminative, until in 1938 it took an exponential, unignorable turn. The night of Kristallnacht was a significant moment in the persecution of Jews in Germany. Now, until this point, although still despicable, the repressive policies had been largely non-violent. However, on the night of Kristallnacht, the Nazis torched synagogues, vandalised Jewish homes, schools and businesses, murdering over 100 Jews. Now, in the aftermath, some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to the concentration camps. Now, after Kristallnacht, conditions for German Jews grew increasingly and drastically worse. And as we know, by the end of the Holocaust, some 6 million Jews had lost their lives, a truly shocking figure. Now, it saddens me that almost 80 years later, the Jewish community are again being unjustly marginalised. The conflict in Gaza, following the horrific terror attacks on Israel by the Hamas terror group on October the 7th, is a terrifying example of religion-based hatred still occurring today. The repercussions of this are a huge surge in anti-Semitic hate in the United Kingdom. It is truly appalling in this country today that school children have to hide their uniforms on the bus to protect themselves just because it shows them to be Jewish. Now, my constituency, Harrow East, boasts a large number of Jewish communities. The cultural, economic and diverse contributions they bring are invaluable, and we should celebrate, not condemn, celebrate what they have brought to our society. Now, at times like this, we need to come together as one to fight hatred, not ignite further cultural wars in this country. Israel is a small country, and so it's highly likely that Jewish people in the UK will have family, friends or connections who are suffering from the deadly attacks Hamas are inflicting on the State of Israel every single day. I urge honourable members to reach out to any friends or local people and offer your thoughts, prayers and support at this undoubtedly difficult time for them. To conclude, we must always ensure that we remember the great struggle of the Jewish community, learn from the Holocaust to ensure never again will such grave actions take place. We must do so not just for the sake of our generation, but future generations to come. And out of respect for all those who sadly lost their lives during the time of the Holocaust. I'll end with one line from Ziggy Shepper, who made one important point: do not hate.
Theresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I feel humbled and privileged to be able to take part in this very solemn debate, and I think this year, as in past years, this is an opportunity to show the House of Commons at its best, and it's an honour to follow powerful interventions by the members for Barking, Beckenham, Brigg and Goole and others. Every year in preparing for Holocaust Memorial Day, I struggle all over again to comprehend how a well-educated, cultured, seemingly civilised society in Germany could turn on its Jewish citizens with such cold-hearted barbarism. Jewish communities which had been part of Central and Eastern Europe for centuries, communities so dehumanised by hate-filled Nazi propaganda that most people just stood by when their Jewish neighbours were herded into ghettos and then onto trucks and trains bound for the death camps. And Holocaust Memorial Day is an opportunity to remember a series of genocidal crimes, including the Holodomor perpetrated on the Ukrainian people, about which I've spoken in past debates. But it's hard to think of anything that can match the sheer scale of the evil perpetrated by the Nazis in carrying out murder on an industrial scale, brutally cutting short the lives of 6 million Jewish men, women and children, and millions of others just because they were gay or Roma or Sinti or disabled or because they were brave enough to resist the Nazis. We need also to remember the heroes who stepped up and saved people, sometimes putting their own lives at risk. And of course, there were those heroes here who organised the Kinder transport and saved many lives. But I think we also need to reflect on this country's approach to its mandate in Palestine and its decision to seek to reduce Jewish migration to Palestine in the 1930s, just when so many were trying to flee attacks in Europe. It's possible that many more could have escaped the Nazis if the British Mandate authorities had taken a different approach. And even after the savagery of the Holocaust was fully revealed, British resistance to Jewish migration to the Holy Land continued. You know, those Jewish people turning up trying to make a new life for themselves in the new Jewish state they'd been promised were turned away and left in displaced persons camps, some even sent back to Germany from where they've come. And it's crucial, as many have said in the debate today, as I think everyone has said, that we remember the victims of the Holocaust at a time when anti-Semitism is rising again in a way which is utterly unacceptable in any civilised society. So today and the coming days are an opportunity to warn once again younger generations of the appalling consequences of anti-Semitism and where it can lead. And I'd recommend anyone wishing to understand what happened visit Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. That's the only museum that's ever reduced me to tears. And one of the most powerful exhibits is the display of shoes taken from Holocaust victims in the concentration camps. These personal possessions, suitcases, glasses, shoes, provide one of the defining images of Holocaust remembrance. And just like my honourable friend for West Bromwich East, I felt a palpable sense of shock just a few weeks ago when I saw another collection of shoes and belongings forever lost to the Jewish people who owned them. I saw that at a display at an exhibition in Tel Aviv on the Hamas terror attack on the Nova Music Festival. These items had been retrieved from the Nova site, and they provided a truly chilling and harrowing reminder of that Yad Vashem display. And I saw the Nova exhibition as part of a trip to Israel declared on my register of interests. And during that visit, I too saw the chilling 47-minute film of footage from the 7th of October attacks. I didn't want to see that film, I felt I ought to. The horror of that footage stays with me in my nightmares, and I mean that literally, it haunts my sleeping hours. Once you see it, you cannot ever unsee it. But I want to talk about just one aspect of that film. I don't want to dwell on the horrors it contained, but I was so struck by the brief clips shown of young people hiding in portaloos or seemingly in a rubbish skip at the festival. These scenes are painfully reminiscent again of the Holocaust, scenes portrayed in films like Schindler's List of children desperately trying to find any hiding place to escape the liquidation of the ghetto and deportation, and the horror of seeing these scenes replayed just over 100 days ago. And we should be in no doubt in this House of the genocidal intentions of Hamas towards Israel and all Jewish people, intentions which are in their founding charter and which they have reiterated many times since the 7th of October atrocity. And I want to conclude with a reflection on the recent and brave article by Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mavis, responding to those who accuse Israel of genocide. We should heed his words that misappropriation of the word genocide is an affront to the victims of the unspeakable crimes which we are remembering today. As he said, its use in this context is the ultimate demonization of the Jewish state. It is a moral inversion which undermines the memory of the worst crimes in human history. So as we say never again on Holocaust Memorial Day, as we renew our personal commitment to combating anti-Semitism, and racism, let us remember that November march in London, where hundreds of thousands turned out to support Israel and the Jewish community, many with placards telling us never again is now. Our vigilance against anti-Jewish hatred must never cease, wherever and however it manifests itself.
Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's 22 years since I attended my first Holocaust Memorial Day event in Hendon. And after all those years, I would have thought that there's nothing left to say. But I feel today's contributions show there's even more to say, which is in many ways a great disappointment. The first event was held in a marquee in Hendon Park. And while I welcome the idea of a Holocaust Memorial Day, I did question the sustainability of such an event. Would it really be able to continue in the longer term? Because at that time, in 2002, I think it was, anti-Semitism wasn't an issue that it certainly is today. And it certainly wasn't an issue as it was leading up to and included during the period of the Holocaust perpetuated by the Nazis. But the first event was well attended by many people, and many of those people were Jewish, but that's not surprising because many of the people in my constituency are of the Jewish faith. But there were also Holocaust survivors who attended, such as my good friend Renee Salt, and I was pleased to see her then, as I'm pleased to see her each year now. But over the years, I've welcomed, as the member for Chipping Barnet said, I've welcomed attending the event. I never say that I'm pleased to attend, because that's not appropriate, but it has become valued to attend. And during these years, Barnet Council has acknowledged more than just the shower, The show, of course, is the name Jewish people use to describe the Holocaust perpetuated by the Nazis. So past speakers have included not just survivors of the Nazis and their relatives, some of them even elected councillors in Barnet, but also people who survived the Bosnian massacres, the Rwandan genocide, and the purge in Cambodia. For many years, I've been interested in the Holocaust. I was interested in how it happened, how it came about, why no one spoke out against it, why ordinarily decent middle-class Germans either did not know about it or refused to accept that it happened, and what the consequences of it remain today. I remember reading Art Spiegelman's books, Maus, M-A-U-S, when I was a teenager. He brought the horrors of the Holocaust to me as a third generation since the war in the late 1980s. Now, it should be remembered, as the member for Orkney and Shetland reminded us, it was just 40 years since the end of the Second World War at that time. So for people who experienced the 1939-1945 war, such a perception of events would be the same I have of the Falklands conflict in 1982. But where Spiegelman's book ended is his father emigrating to America. So it's left to other authors, such as Leon Uris in the book Exodus, to describe what really happened to most displaced Jewish people after the war. Now, it's been acknowledged, and it's not disputed, that the UK refused to take refugees from Jewish communities after the Second World War. And there were many other countries in Europe as well that refused to. Some of the populations took part in murders of Jews alongside the Nazis. Others had simply misappropriated Jewish lands and property and weren't giving it back. So Jewish people had nowhere to go. So it was vital that a homeland was provided for these survivors. Now, Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people, and it was the right course of action to re-establish the country on the 14th of May 1948. Almost half of all Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, 49% today, live in Israel. And about 18% live in North America, and about 18% in Western Europe. And an approximate 1,200 survivors live in Britain, many of them in the Hendon constituency. But as Lord Blencathra told the Holocaust Memorial Select Committee this week, the way different generations discover our history has changed. Many now read information from the internet. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, we all know that not everything that appears online is entirely accurate. But this has an impact on what people learn and their perceptions of past and current conflicts. So for many people around the country, the Holocaust is something they know happened, but it doesn't impact upon them. But that isn't the experience of many people in my constituency. Yesterday I spoke to a neighbour of mine, and she told me about her daughter's experience at university at UCL. As she said, they are a liberal Jewish family, have a Jewish faith, but are not Orthodox. You would not know by looking at them, particularly, that they are Jewish. And unless my constituent's daughter told you that she was Jewish, it wouldn't be apparent. But what her daughter has heard in lectures in the university and in the university itself are things that she refuses to leave unchallenged. She's not a belligerent person. I've known her for many years. But students have told her that there are no Arabs in Israel. All Jews are wealthy. Jews control the world. All the usual tropes that we're now hearing more and more. But she's pushed back. But she's been shunned by the other pupils who refuse to sit next to her in lectures. Another student complained that there's an anti-Semitism czar at UCL. Now, my constituent's daughter said it was not a competition or even a privilege to have a czar. But that explanation was rejected, and a demand has subsequently been made that there should be an anti-Islamophobic czar for no other reason than because there is an anti-Semitism czar. So young people in my constituency are now fearful of attending university, and it's obvious why. Jewish students are held responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, and the same is now steadily creeping into our schools. Now, there's a clear link between these attitudes and the terrorist attacks in Israel on the 7th of October. Those attacks were no different from what the Nazis were doing. Their intention was to kill as many Jews as possible, and it remains a real concern to many of my constituents. Just like the Holocaust deniers, there are deniers of what happened in Israel on the 7th of October. Now, I struggle a bit at this point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because I can't turn around and look at my good friend in Brigg and Goole, because we did actually visit Israel a few weeks after the attacks, and we did see things that I certainly never expected to see. And I did warn the member for Chip and Barnet not to watch the 47-minute video. But we saw not only that video, but another video. And as we were at the Shura base, and the colonel, I believe who was in charge, opened the mortuary. And what I remember, just like the member for Beckenham, is the smell. It's a smell not only of blood and death, which I have smelt before, but also of formaldehyde, some kind of chemical that's used to preserve the bodies. Now, many of the bodies were left there, approximately 200, because they couldn't be identified. And the reason they couldn't be identified is some were headless, some were just a head, others were limbs, and some were more than one bodies fused together by fire. And what really upset myself and the member for Brigg and Goole was when the colonel whipped out of his pocket a video on his phone and he showed it to us. And that is something that I won't even mention what was on it. And I don't talk to my staff, I don't talk to my family about what was there, but that really is something that is not in the 47-minute video and is not something that can be forgotten. But the events on the 7th of October are also quite personal due to the fact that Nathaniel Young was one of the first to be killed. Nathaniel was a student in my area at Beresford School, and I recently visited and was quite upset when I saw his photo on the wall. And the photo showed him with me and with Lord Cameron at the 2013 Hanukkah event at number 10. He was part of the choir. And I remember him distinctly because of his exuberance and his vitality. But in the weeks since the October the 7th, I've received several emails from constituents which have been touched upon by people today. And I think it's important to actually just to outline some of what people have said to me. One email said, I'm writing to you today as a concerned member of your constituency, and more importantly, as a British Jew who is increasingly fearful for the safety of my family, friends and community. Recent events have compelled me to express my deep concerns about the rise of anti-Semitic incidents and the apparent inadequacy of the response from law enforcement. Following the advice from the police on October the 7th, instructing our sons to conceal their Jewish symbols while travelling to school, my family and I are already grappling with a heightened sense of vulnerability. As a community, we have observed instances where the police seem to turn a blind eye to chance and unpleasant behaviour during weekly marches, fostering an environment where anti-Semitic sentiments are allowed to flourish unchecked. Recent events have left me questioning the assurances we once held that if these protests were to turn violent, the police would intervene decisively. She goes on to mention the alleged assault on a group of Israelis in Leicester Square on the 20th of January. But she concludes by saying that she feels that she cannot allow her son to use any Hebrew words or Jewish-sounding words when travelling, out of fear that he may become a target for senseless violence. It's deeply disheartening to realise that in London, in 2024, Jewish people feel compelled to hide their identity and censor their innocent language for their own safety. Anti-Semitism isn't restricted either to my constituents, as I've been subjected to 2 incidents in the recent weeks, the second of which remains under consideration for prosecution, so I can't say any more. But in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll be attending Holocaust Memorial Day this year in Hendon, and I will value it as ever before. And there will be a day that the Shoah will be an ancient historical tragedy. But unfortunately, that won't be for many years yet.
Wind-ups. Kirsten, Oswald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'm grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for granting the time for this debate, which I was very happy to be a co-sponsor of. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for Barking for the way in which she opened the debate today. I think it is very important that we have this debate every year, and particularly in this particular chamber, and this year, of course, that was all the more pressing. Like others, I would like to put on record my thanks to the Holocaust Educational Trust and the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust for their year-round work, as well as their support at this time of year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is Burns Night tonight, and his famous line, "Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn," well stands the test of time when we look at the world today and when we look to the Holocaust and the continued impact down the generations. Like the Honourable Member for Brigg and Goole, I'm often frustrated by the increasing polarisation of politics and views. There are far more shades than black and white, and public discourse is always the better for appreciating that and trying to at least understand the spectrum of views that are different from one's own. But on this particular issue, maybe it's the exception that proves the rule. The importance of Holocaust remembrance and understanding why that matters is a black and white situation. There is one clear way to look at things. And that matters because in an age of increased tension, of global flux, the growing influence of those whose very purpose is to foster hatred for others, we need to be ever more clear that never again must be made to mean exactly that. It won't happen without specific and concerted effort. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is the fragility of freedom. And to me, things do seem that bit more fragile and that bit more strained. I was struck hearing that same point being made by Rabbi Rubin, the senior rabbi of Scotland, earlier this week. And I speak often in this place about the importance of freedom to follow the religion or the freedom to follow no religion of your choice. Across the globe, that freedom is clearly increasingly under threat. And here we have heard this today, we're witnessing eye-watering spikes in anti-Semitism and in Islamophobia. So we need to mean what we say and stand up against that hatred, stand up against the misinformation and disinformation, the tropes and the trolls and the plain Holocaust deniers. I thought the Honourable Member for Hendon made a good point about the significant challenges in the online space. And we need to be vigilant and face hard truths, because intolerance and hatred are increasing, and those who peddle hatred here and across the world do feel empowered. I thought the Honourable Member for Worthing spoke very powerfully about the huge dangers posed by people spreading conspiracies and the efforts to erode and to deny democracy. So we need to remember that genocides don't just suddenly happen in faraway places. They're always the product of gradual and deliberate othering, demeaning, dehumanising and diminishing of people simply because of their identity. As the Honourable Member for West Ham pointed out, they're fuelled by ordinary people acting in extraordinarily awful ways, empowered by that and encouraging and normalising hatred. And that leads to the industrial scale evil that the Right Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet described. I was fortunate to attend my local Holocaust Memorial event at the start of this week, as I do every year. These events have, without exception, been profoundly moving, and this year was no different. So I'm very grateful to East Renfrewshire Council and the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, particularly Kirsty Robson, for putting the event together so effectively. And our young people were at the heart of that event, and I applaud them all for their efforts. Students from all our local schools were there, and in particular, Christopher James and Sarah Bone from St Ninian's High School, who spoke about their involvement as Holocaust Educational Trust ambassadors, and Lexi Davidson from Mearns Castle High School, who's been working with the Anne Frank Trust. Kayla Kalitsa Molina, who is a young woman whose mother was caught up in the Rwanda genocide, read us a poem she had written about the experience of her mother and so many others. It was entitled, "We All Bleed the Same," and you could have heard a pin drop. And that point that she made, that point about the fragility of freedom, I think is illustrated so effectively by the individual histories. The Honourable Member for Barking talked about her own family's journey. So much of that seemed to be very dependent upon chance, and it struck me it could have been a very different story. And we need to remember that. We're talking about people, families, not just the unfathomable number that we too often think about when we're thinking of the Holocaust, and neglect the individuals who perished. At the event I attended, we also heard from Geraldine Schenken, who spoke so powerfully about her lovely mum, Marianne Grant, whose story has been captured in materials used in Scottish schools thanks to the work of Vision Schools Scotland. as well as in a beautiful book of her mum's art, which is now on permanent display in Kelvin Grove Museum. I thought Geraldine was exceptionally brave in telling the story, and I know that in doing so she spared us some detail because she was aware of the number of school children in the audience. Suffice to say that her mum endured the most terrifying, inhumane and shocking treatment as she survived Theresienstadt and Auschwitz before her liberation from Bergen-Belsen. Marianne Grant was an artist, and while in Auschwitz she was forced to draw for Dr. Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, and she recalled him walking forward and backward in his black uniform as she drew in front of her nose like a clock pendulum. The horrors that she experienced are beyond our imaginings, but of course they would have been unimaginable to her too until her life was turned upside down in that most horrific way. The same can be said for the lives of Henry and the late Ingrid Ruga, kinder transport children who escaped and later met, married and made their home in my constituency. They have changed countless lives with their work telling our young people the reality of the Holocaust, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them both for that. Henry Ruga is about to turn 100, and I am sure that the whole house would want to join me in sending him our very best wishes. The importance of that kind of work, sharing the truth about the Holocaust, is increasingly more important. And I met again with Gathering the Voices this week and heard more about Martin Anson, whose story is so important. He talks about growing anti-Jewish sentiment in his Bavarian hometown in the early 1920s, his activities in the anti-Nazi movement, stormtroopers assaulting his family on Kristallnacht, and his imprisonment in Dachau before he managed to emigrate to Scotland just before the outbreak of war. And his son Stephen told me about a trip he made last year to his father's former home where a Solperstein was laid down, a stone in the ground. And usually it was laid down to record the former home of someone who'd survived. Usually these stones record those who have been lost. And on that visit, something that was very striking to Stephen was the warm welcome of the family who live in that house now. It was an incredible story to hear, and the generosity of spirit of the current occupants, I think, is a ray of hope in a very harrowing history. It wouldn't be a Holocaust Memorial Day debate for me without me touching on a ray of hope which was offered up in the person of Jane Haining, the Scottish matron in a Budapest school who refused to leave her young Jewish charges despite knowing what the dangers were, and who paid for that decision with her life. She said about the children, "If they need me in times of sunshine, how much more must they need me in times of darkness?" And that sentiment is one very much worth holding on to at this time when everything feels a bit more fragile and less certain than that we'd perhaps become comfortably used to. And Jane Haining is the only Scot to be named as righteous among nations at Yad Vashem. And it will take us all of us here, but all of us in our communities too, to say that we won't tolerate anti-Semitism, we won't accept hatred, we won't accept people being othered and demeaned because of their identity. Freedom really is fragile, and all of us together are the key to sustaining and strengthening it. So please let's try and heed the terrible lessons of the past. Let's try and work hard together to keep the voices of those who survived alive, so that those who come after us can hear their testimony too and can protect that fragile freedom.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a great honour to be responding on behalf of the opposition to this important debate on Holocaust Memorial Day. And I would like to start by commending my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, for introducing this debate today, and the Backbench Business Committee for allowing the time. I'd like to start by thanking my honourable friends for their contribution. I've already mentioned the right honourable member for Barking, who told us about her family's personal experiences immediately after the war and in the war. And she talked about the fact that freedom is fragile, and that has certainly been apparent in the debate today. And she also said, when will we ever learn? And I think that has been repeated by many members across the House today. Now, as we've heard, this Saturday, the 27th of January, is Holocaust Memorial Day and the 79th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's an opportunity for us to come together and remember the 6 million Jewish victims who were murdered by the Nazi regime, as well as the millions of lives lost to genocidal violence in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur. And the Honourable Member for West Ham, in her speech, referred to the testimony of Theresa in the Rwandan genocide and the horrors of that genocide. This year's Holocaust Memorial Day marks the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide and the murder of up to 1 million Tutsis in just 100 days by violent Hutu extremists. We remember the families, communities, cultures and traditions lost forever to hatred and persecution. And we pay tribute to the survivors, their lives irrevocably altered by devastating violence. We owe them a great gratitude for sharing their testimonies and exposing the true horrors that they have experienced in order for us all to bear witness. And my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham, Selly Oak, talked about the fact that it wasn't after World War II. He heard about some of the events of World War II, but it wasn't until he became an adult that he learnt about the atrocities that were committed as well, and stressed that need for us to continue with educating people. We, recalling his return to the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said that it swallowed an entire people, a people with hopes and memories. And this week we honour those hopes and memories and the rich individual lives that lie behind the dreadful statistics that have been referenced across the House throughout the course of this debate. We remember also the many others killed during the Nazi regime, including more than 250,000 disabled people, up to 500,000 Roma and Sinti people, and thousands of LGBT people, many of whom have had to fight to be recognised as victims. These crimes were the most terrifying consequences of identity-based persecution. Today, people around the world and here in the UK continue to face deep hostility because of who they are. Over the past decade, we've seen rises in hate crime of every category. Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities face persistent discrimination. Many LGBT plus people continue to face hostile environments, Mr Deputy Speaker. And in the months since October the 7th, we have, as we have heard today, seen unprecedented rises in incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. This Holocaust Memorial Day, we must all remember our common humanity. We must remember, too, that the prevention of atrocities begins at home, and we must seek to unite our communities, prevent hatred and polarisation, and warn against the dangers posed by insidious hatred. This year's theme, Fragility of Freedom, is a call for us to reject complacency and to pay attention to the processes that restrict and remove the freedoms of those targeted for persecution. As soon as the Nazis took power in 1933, they weaponised every lever of the state to erode the freedoms of German Jews, passing decrees and regulations to limit the participation of Jewish people in public life. The 1935 Nuremberg laws proscribed marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and in so doing robbed Jewish people of their freedom of religion and self-identification. As Nazi horror spread against Europe, Jews in occupied countries were forced into ghettos and deported to concentration or extermination camps. This was the ultimate manifestation of violence, which took away their freedom to live. But it did not come from nowhere. That's why this year's theme asks us to remember how climates for genocide are created. It's a reminder that freedom can be vulnerable and that we should not take it for granted. By providing a focal point, Holocaust Memorial Day ensures that we come together to remember and to mourn victims of genocide each and every year. This week, local activities will be taking place all over the UK, and I pay tribute to the many organisers who are ensuring that generations of young people continue to hear these vital messages. It's estimated that more than 10,000 such local activities take place across the UK around the 27th of January each year. That is a magnificent achievement. I pay tribute also to the Holocaust Educational Trust and the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, who have worked hard to embed understanding about the Holocaust into our education system. It's thanks to the Holocaust Educational Trust that learning about the Holocaust has now been a compulsory part of the national curriculum for more than 30 years. Since 2006, the Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project has allowed post-16 students in schools and colleges to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the face of dangerous Holocaust denial and distortion, these lessons are of paramount importance. Recognising the essential nature of Holocaust education, we have supported the Holocaust Memorial Bill from its outset. Just like Holocaust Memorial Day, the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre will provide yet another essential focal point for genocide education and commemoration in the UK. It will preserve the memory of the Holocaust, convey the truths about its nature, and crucially, serve as a fitting tribute to the 6 million Jewish people murdered by the Nazis. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am pleased that today's debate has given us the opportunity to come together to reject hatred and to strive for a better future, never forgetting the lives, families and communities lost to the most horrifying violence.
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is my first attendance at a Holocaust Memorial Day debate in this place. And I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm rather glad that it is, because I must be honest with the House, if I had had any idea as to the raw emotion, I might have dodged it. I can tell the House I'm so glad I didn't. It's been sad, it's been frightening, but every word has been worth hearing. I want to thank the House and all of those who have contributed to today's debate. It has been a true privilege, Mr Deputy Speaker, to be here to hear. As many Right Honourable and Honourable Members have noted, this year's day's theme is fragility of freedom. That's not just a fragility of freedom in emerging democracies or elsewhere in the world. It is a threat and a challenge to all of our mature Western democracies, where we have grown, frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, complacent of our rights and our privileges, our freedoms to think, speak, write, congregate, worship, pray. Too much of it under attack, whether from social media, the ease of populism, the search for the simple in a complex world. So much we hold dear is under pressure. So therefore, let us today, cross-party, as this debate has amplified the House can do at its best, when it's at its best, champion and defend all that we hold and cherish dear to our hearts. But let us do more than that. Let us not just be armchair or indeed green bench Democrats. Let us be, as my honourable friend, the member for Brigg and Goole, suggested, muscular and robust in our stance and in our defence. Because in collaborative defence, there is courage, there is hope, and there is opportunity. Mr Deputy Speaker, the big numbers of the Holocaust make it hard to envisage, as all big numbers and statistics do. So let us just pause for a moment, not to think of 6 million as just another statistic. The Auschwitz Memorial Twitter feed, or X feed as we now have to call it, virtually every day, and I follow it, presents a picture or pictures of men, women, children, ordinary folk, starved, taken from their homes, persecuted, and incinerated, the true meaning of the word Holocaust, for their faith. Let us recommit to always seeing these people for what they are, people, fellow human beings, never as just a statistic, whether they be Jewish, Bosnian, Rwandan, or Cambodian. The issue that we must always remember, and as many contributors to the debate have reminded us so powerfully this afternoon, is that the Jewish people has always been a people forced to look over their shoulders down the centuries. Pogroms, Holocaust, displacement, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Dreyfus case. A people always worried that they are only temporarily tolerated rather than permanently welcomed. I'm going to call her my right honourable friend, the right honourable lady, the member for Barking. She added a poignancy to her characteristically brave and bold remarks and thinking by reminding the House, sadly, that this is the last debate that she will take part in as a Member of Parliament. As the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, forgive me, the Member for Orkney and Shetland said, she will be missed, but she won't be forgotten. And her words, her important words on this issue, particularly during difficult years for her and her Jewish colleagues in her party, and thank God that is changing, where she stood bravely on difficult and hostile benches, and she made her case as she did today. My job, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is to reply to the debate, to respond to speeches. So I'm going to try, with the leave of the House, just to reference a nugget or two from each contribution, because I think they merit it, and the seriousness of the issues at hand do as well. And I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady from the opposition, both for her words and for the spokesman for the SNP, and I know that she's given me a little bit more time than the usual channels may have agreed to. My honourable friend, the member for Worthing West, the father of the House, spoke powerfully about the fragility of democracy. He was right, and as so many members went on to do, point to the importance of education. We don't repeat when we know, and we only know when we are educated. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Orkney and Shetland, spoke about his constituency and the story of rescuing those fleeing persecution in Norway, a new piece of historical fact to me, and the House would be grateful for it. My right honourable and gallant friend, the member for Beckenham, spoke in his characteristically frank but moving way about his experience in Yugoslavia. 2 points I would say to my right honourable friend. He is right to remind the House, and we are right to remind ourselves, that those events took place not in a faraway land of which we knew nothing, but on our doorstep in just 1993. And I want to say this personally to my right honourable friend. He spoke of his shame and the shame of his mother. For what it's worth, can I say to him, he has nothing to be ashamed about. He and his men did their best, and that is all we as a democracy can ever ask. The member for West Ham, who is in Westminster Hall on a debate about religious freedom, so there is a link even today. She's not in her place for that reason, but she gave us a powerful speech on Rwanda. She reminded us of the horror of rape and sexual violence, as my honourable friend, the member for Hendon, and for Brigg and Goole, and for Chipping Barnet did in relation to the horror events of October the 7th. I sat and listened, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as a husband and a father of 3 daughters, and who would not be moved to think that those horrible events could be taking place just a few short weeks ago. A common theme has been smell, an often underspoken of sense. We talk about our memories of what we've seen or heard, but smell can be hugely evocative. of a time, place in our childhood, a holiday, or whatever. My honourable friend for Hendon is a doctor. He will have been used to the smell of medical things, I have no doubt. My right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, and my honourable friend, the member for Brigg and Goole, spoke also of the recent smell of death and rotting flesh. A great friend of mine's father had been part of the medical team going into Belsen, and to his death he always spoke about the smell that was still on his skin. We should remember that always. I have referenced, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady speech from Edinburgh West, where again she spoke of the complacency of its all history. It's not, it's happening now. And when we think it's history, when we think it either isn't happened or can't happen again, we've lost the battle, haven't we? Because what was the Holocaust? And why should we remember it? We can remember it for the horror and the statistics and the figures and the scale. But the eternal shame, to use my right honourable friend from Beckenham's phrase, is that it was man's inhumanity to man. And we should all be ashamed and embarrassed by it, because it shows at the darkest and basest moments of humankind precisely what we can do to each other in the name of doctrine, in the name of theology, in the name of ideology. It is a terrible thing that we have somewhere deep within our DNA. Let us resolve to keep it buried. My honourable friend, the member from Mole Valley, spoke powerfully about hatred and prejudice, and again spoke of the importance of education. I want to especially mark the speech of the honourable gentleman, the member for Birmingham, Selly Oak. I hope he won't take it the wrong way when I say I thought it was in his frank assessment of current events that he gave us, for a member for Birmingham, it was a brave speech. I was pleased to hear it. The House will be grateful to have heard it, and he should be commended, I say this for what it's worth, for delivering it with the heartfelt and sincere way that he did. My honourable friend, the member for West Bromwich East, in that simple memory of a shoe and a piece of makeup, so reminiscent of the museum where the shoes of those who died were gathered up as a reminder. I think it just reminds us of the simplicity and therefore the futility. Ordinary people going about their lives in an ordinary way on an ordinary day, and suddenly, as a result of somebody's bigotry and hatred, all taken up. The lipstick, the powder, the mascara, whatever it may happen to be, the pair of dancing shoes, they will stand as a longer-lasting memorial than any statue or plaque that could be erected. My honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, again, this theme of education, and I pay tribute to all of those, the Holocaust Educational Trust and others who day in and day out ensure that we never forget. We are right to remind ourselves of the importance of that. And those who have spoken of the important role that our universities and schools play in order to ensure free and fair speech, that all voices can be heard, that tolerance and toleration are the hallmarks of a civilised democracy. They need to step up to the plate, Mr Deputy Speaker, and play their part, as this place does, in ensuring that those are preserved and protected. The Honourable Lady, the member for the opposition, gave a heartfelt speech, as did the SNP spokesman, and we commend her for that. And how right my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, and my honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, were to remind us of the uncomfortable truth, as the right honourable lady for Barking did as well, of our slightly uncomfortable position with regards to the welcoming of Jewish children through the kinder transport, but not their parents, and the controls that we place with regards to Jewish migration, and the problems that that caused for too many people. I could go on, Mr Deputy Speaker, because this has been a moving debate on a mammoth issue of both history, 80 years ago, and more recent, but also so fresh and contemporary today, it chills us to the bone and it scares us. But in conclusion, let me say this. However, and I should actually apologise to the Hansard scribes, my officials will have given you a typed speech. As usual, I've ignored it because the speeches I've heard this afternoon were given from the hearts of my colleagues, and I wanted to respond on behalf of the government in kind. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, however, wherever, whoever and whenever, how they died, where they died, who they were, let us unite today and always to mark and reflect all of those who have lost their lives to both the Holocaust and all Holocausts. May all of their sacrifices not have been in vain. May all of their memories, Mr. Deputy Speaker, be a blessing.
Dame Margaret Hodge to wind up the debate.
I'm not going to keep the House, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I just want to echo the words of the Minister and actually the Right Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet. I think this is the House at its best when we can all speak across the chamber in unity on issues which are probably a million times more important than anything else we debate in the House through the years. So I thank every member of the House who has participated in the debate today for their very warm speeches and their very important speeches. And then I just wanted to reflect a little bit. I also went to the Nova Festival that the Honourable Member for West Bromwich went to, and the Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet mentioned. And I think that picture of the shoes lying there of people who were slaughtered at that festival and how it reminded us of the Holocaust and what you see in Auschwitz is just something that I don't think any of us can forget. I never smelt the smell in Kfar. We probably went a few weeks after the two honourable members, but I felt the misery and the horror that they all experienced in that. And I agree with all honourable members that the growth of anti-Semitism on our streets today, as with the growth of Islamophobia, is something which should chill us all and should make us think about how we do. My final words really come from what the Honourable Member for Harrow East said. Jews have maintained hope through the generations. That's probably why we've survived in the way we have. And I hope that we can leave today's debate with a feeling of hope and determination that we will build a society of tolerance, both here and across the world, and that we should learn that hate will not bring us that peaceful coexistence that we all want. But freedom is fragile, and we have to all put every effort into securing freedom for everybody, wherever they live, whoever they are, and whatever their background and religion. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
May I thank all honourable members who participated today for the manner in which they've conducted themselves. I'm sure it will have been appreciated outside this House as well as within it. Question is, as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that